Hello, folks, and welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports here on the Indaba Africa channel. It's Chris live in central Pennsylvania with my guest today, none other than the Conscious Caracal himself, Ernst van Zyl, with AfriForum these days. Ernst, today we're going to talk about race-based legislation in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. You had a conference. Can you tell us a little bit about that conference and what the focus was?
Goeienaand, Chris. Thank you very much for having me on again. Yes, we did have a conference at AfriForum this week. It was a conference with speakers, and the topic was race-based policy in South Africa, or more specifically, BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, but with capital letters. So, that was the topic. The three speakers, I was one of the speakers, but then also Martin van Staden from the Free Market Foundation, and also Phumlani Majosia, author and political analyst.
Marco van Staden, I've interviewed in the past, and I've met him as well from the Free Market Foundation, along with David Ansara and others. So, the graph for this, the image for the banner for this, shows the progression of race-based legislation that really kicked off after Hendrik Verwoerd and the National Party won the election in 1948. They began already by 1950 pushing legislation based on race, excluding people from segments of society, passed laws, keeping people from getting married and having offspring, dispossessing people. And that continued and peaked in the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, around the time of the Soweto riots. But after that, that whole system began to be dismantled, and most race-based legislation had disappeared by 1992. In fact, all the main egregious stuff. But since the African National Congress has come into office, we've seen not only a return to race-based legislation, but an unashamed return to race-based legislation. I mean, things as stupid as the Tourism Relief Fund a couple of years ago during the COVID lockdown. The government explicitly stated that only historically disadvantaged, read black communities, could actually benefit from it. And the stupidity of such a thing, not realizing that the people who work for companies that aren't owned by black folks have jobs, and they're going to go under. Is that an accurate description of what's happened to this sine wave of race-based legislation? It dipped, and now it's come back with a vengeance?
Well, Chris, you summed it up very well in regards that South Africa has been a racialist regime for over 100 years now, and it has continued to be a racialist regime into the 21st century. Quite a damning label or trophy for a regime to earn, but that's the fact. So that's why specifically also Martin van Staden was such a valuable speaker at our conference, because he did the research. He went into the history of race-based legislation in South Africa since 1910, and he found some very interesting stuff. So just a few notes that I made here from Martin's presentation. So since the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, approximately 313 race-based laws have been introduced. More than 116, or 37%, that's just over a third of these, were created after the ANC had come into power in 1994. So, I mean, tell that you can knock someone down with some of those facts. If you tell them in the United States, you tell them, did you know that 37% of South Africa's race laws came into effect after 1994? They're like, what are you talking about?
Well, and in fact, the world doesn't want to accept the reality that is the ANC ruled South Africa. It is a race-hustling, race-based regime, which is intent on destroying the country. We just saw this week, not race-related, but race came into it. Today, at the signing ceremony by President Cyril Ramaphosa for the biggest abomination, which will be the wholesale nationalization of the healthcare sector, national health insurance bill signed into law by Ramaphosa, just with a big grin like a Cheshire cat there, like the leopard who just stole the meal from the hyenas or something, or the hyenas who stole it from the leopard, however that works. He seemed very pleased with himself, but of course last night he's at a big event and he's talking about that about how white people are fearful of this because they don't want the have-nots to have anything. I mean, you can't get any more racial or race hustling than that. I mean, he spends all his time trying to denigrate white South Africans, which is where a fair portion of his tax base comes from. I don't understand why people like this do this. At some point, it loses currency with the population. And I don't know if that's happening now, but if the polls are to be believed, the ANC will be out of power, as I predicted. And it looks like in the range that I predicted, 42 to 38% was the range I came up with in November of 2021. It looks like that's where they're polling at now. We'll see who goes to the polls. But I think that people are beginning, at least enough people are beginning to see just how much nonsense this is. But this is the stock and trade of the ANC, is it not, in the 21st century, race hustling and racial legislation?
Well, it's just you're absolutely correct, Chris. It's what they have become in regards to what has defined them. The ANC's legacy, one of the main things defining their legacy will be their race-based obsession, their race agenda. And I mean, you're completely correct. Even today, when the disastrous National Health Insurance Bill was signed into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa, he couldn't help but attack white people. He couldn't help but target a certain demographic within the country, because that's it. We live in a country where it seems some people it's okay to target them in your rhetoric if you're a politician. And so Ramaphosa, being an ANC cadre, seems to not be able to help himself. He couldn't help but put that little jab in there. Now, what's also very important to understand, and this is why also these types of conferences are very important, is that I do feel that the zeitgeist is turning against the race-based legislation from the ANC, because BEE is the best example. It's an exclusive club, and the vast majority of South Africans aren't in it. Every single survey shows this, that the vast majority of people polled say that they have never benefited from a BEE deal or anything associated. And that's the reality of it. It's a piece of racial legislation that not just is not achieving what it says it wants to achieve, it's also creating a new elite. That's all it has done. It should be called CEE, Cadre in Economic Enrichment, because that's all it has achieved. And the thing is, you don't even have to speculate. You can just point to the facts. You can point to the reality. It's there for anyone to see with eyes that work. And the average South African sees that BEE is not working for them. And you can see the public sentiment across races, across cultures, across backgrounds, turning against this firstly disastrous policy that has not achieved desirable outcomes, and secondly, and we need to start using this language, immoral policy, because you are excluding people from employment based on the color of their skin. The best example of that was Dis-Chem, the big pharmaceutical company in South Africa that no, it wasn't last year, it's 2022, that leaked memo, that internal memo where the CEO said that we now have to put a moratorium on any hiring of white people or promotion of white people under pressure from the government, because the government will put fines on us that will put our business in jeopardy if we don't discriminate and become as race obsessed as they do, as they are. And that's the immorality of these policies. But the sneaky thing is, and this is how the ANC get away with it, or have been getting away with it up until now, is that they give these immoral and unjustifiable policies these beautiful flowery names. So they'll call it black economic empowerment. You can't be against black economic empowerment, can you? But it's black economic empowerment with capital letters. It's a policy. It's not the idea of empowering people. That when, for example, AfriForum says that it is against black economic empowerment, it's not against black economic empowerment with small letters, as in the empowerment of black people. AfriForum is not against the empowerment of anyone, but AfriForum is very, very strongly against the policy of black economic empowerment for the reasons that I've outlined already.
Well, I've always called it immoral. Apartheid was legal, but it was immoral. These laws by the ANC are legal, but they're immoral. This is shameful, and I've always called it immoral. I'm glad that you're saying that people should start calling it that. I've been calling it that all along. And I also, like a number of people, accurately predicted exactly what was going to happen. It was going to be pigs at the trough. We've seen this before. It's a cadre enrichment scheme. That's what it is. That's what it's always been, and that's all they care about. I don't know if you saw this, but at the Mbizo in the Northern Cape a few days ago, the speaker who introduced President Ramaphosa told the people who came there in the Northern Cape, desperately poor, and of course the ANC brought them food parcels, and it has nothing to do with the elections. No, it's just a coincidence we're bringing the food parcels as they buy votes, but told these poor black and colored South Africans that, do you realize the president will receive his last paycheck on May 15th? And it's up to you to go vote to ensure that Cyril Ramaphosa gets a paycheck on June 15th as president. You want to talk about tone deaf? and absolutely bat crap crazy. What do I care about a man who was handed $400 million in equity in companies he didn't earn and has all the riches, walking around with Breitling watches and BMW 7 Series escorts and helicopters and all the attention on the world? What do I care whether he has a paycheck in June? I care about whether I have a paycheck in June. The fact that my daughter was sexually assaulted last night, and the fact there's no freaking water, and that people are, it's unbelievable. This is what's finally starting to wear thin. It's not enough people, but look at the rise of the Patriotic Alliance. A lot of people talk about how it's gaining ground. I think that the sold out or filled stadium in Athlone in Cape Town with 30,000 people plus thousands of others outside who couldn't get in ought to be waking up some folks in the African National Congress, not just the Democratic Alliance, but in the African National Congress, that you are not popular. Look at MK. But of course, that's just a popularity, ethnic-based sort of thing. But the ANC is in trouble here, and it's long overdue.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what a wounded animal does. It starts lashing out, and you can see it in their rhetoric. You can see it in their pushing through of the hate crimes and hate speech bill, a deeply, deeply flawed and dangerous bill that's just setting the table for abuse. That was pushed through. Now with the Bella bill that puts also the language policy of schools completely in the hands of the government, that can now just tell our Afrikaans school, for example, that you will accept English students, and we know how that process goes. You accept, you change the language policy of a single medium Afrikaans school. Soon, then there's one English class, 2, 3, 4, and then after a few years, they say, well, there's so many English students now, you might as well just become single medium English, and then that Afrikaans school
which is
no
not
more.
even the largest language or first language of South Africans.
Yeah.
It's the first language is only about
That's the irony.
6% of South Africans. It's the first language. That is the irony. If anything, you could someone make an argument that Zulu or Afrikaans should be the national language, or maybe Xhosa even, but certainly not English. You know, it's we've seen this movie before. It's exactly what happens. It leads to cultural extinction, cultural genocide. We saw this with the Anglicization of Ireland and with Wales and Scotland, and people had to fight back very seriously. The one that's been most successful, I mean, Manx is extinct. It's gone. It will never come back. Cornish is extinct. It's gone. But Welsh has made a comeback, and it was nearly extinct. Less than, I think, 14% of Welsh spoke any degree of proficiency in the 1960s. But today that figure is much higher, and the language is thriving, although I don't know how. It's impossible to pronounce. I thought G's and Afrikaans were hard till I tried to speak Welsh. Forget that. That's like an alien language altogether. But you've touched on a few bills here that are just really shocking things. So, I mean, I just posted a video yesterday, the Mampara of the week is Cyril Ramaphosa. And gosh, under the hate speech law, is that constitute hate speech? Did I undermine his dignity as a public figure by calling him a Mampara? I mean, this is a very dangerous path to go down. And, you know, you're not alone. We've got, slip up, trip up, fall up the stairs, Joe Biden trying to have a ministry of disinformation in America just to persecute people for free speech. You know, I've always complained about South Africa's government since its constitution in the late 1990s, that it is not a country that believes in free speech. When you criminalize speech like using the K word, which means an unbeliever in Arabic, when you criminalize such things, it shows how fearful a government is, and they're not committed to free speech. Obviously, this government's not committed to free speech. They want a cudgel to beat over the head of any opponent who deigns to stand up and question the government of the day. And it's not just an ANC thing. If this thing becomes law and stays what it is, and stays law without being challenged, then this will be a weapon used by any government of the day to attack its opponents.
I just saw there quickly glancing at the live chat. Gert in the chat asks why my bookshelf is empty. Yeah, we're moving a bit of stuff around here in the house. So the bookshelf, the books are heavy stuff. So at the moment, they're off to one corner. So at the moment, I have an empty bookshelf.
I would have said you had a home invasion and you were robbed by the ANC, but we know they don't read anything intellectual, so that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, fortunately for me, if an ANC cadre were to try to expropriate most of my property, they would revile in disgust when they see that most of my property is just books.
I'd love to see them go try to get Steve Hofmeyer's Afrikaans poetry collection.
Yeah, I don't think they'll be expropriating that anytime soon. But anyway, so another statistic that came out that Martin also touched on that I thought it's shocking. It really puts it into perspective is that So, as I said earlier, 116 pieces of racial legislation have been passed since 1994 under the ANC, but some of the racial legislation from the past have been kept. So that means at the moment, if anyone asks you how many pieces of racial legislation or race laws are there in South Africa, Martin van Staden's research showed that there are currently 141. So that's that graph that you have in the thumbnail. So just over 50% of the race laws that the South African government has passed since 1910 are still active today. So the majority of just to condense that again, because I think it's maybe some people won't on the first listen hear the gravity of this. The majority of racial legislation since 1910 in South Africa is still in effect. So it's still active today. And this total of 141 race laws surpasses the race law total at apartheid's peak. That's the situation where we're currently sitting in. And I mean, that's what some of the shocking statistics that Martin van Staden showed or put in his presentation at our conference. But I mean, one of the best examples also of the ANC picking and choosing what type of legislation from the previous apartheid regime they want to keep is them clinging still to the racial classification system, the exact racial classification system of the apartheid government. The ANC just copy and pasted and said, well, that's nice. I think I'll keep that. Well, why? What are your intentions? Well, we see what the intentions are because they want to have a blueprint to be able to discriminate as they wish, to discriminate as a electioneering tool. The ANC fights for their right to discriminate based on race.
Well, there's one caveat to that. When it's politically expedient for the ANC, black includes Indian and colored. But then in the
even Chinese.
Yeah, and even Chinese are considered black, right? But then in the application of that isn't what plays out. They just use them as useful idiots. Now, Nehemiah Fredericks, who's a proud BE beneficiary, if I'm correct, maybe I got that wrong from the other day, but he said the following, and I'm going to turn this around on him. He said, corporate South Africa during apartheid had no problem adhering to racist legislation, including job reservation for whites and using the black majority as a source of labor. Yeah. That's probably a pretty true statement for much of corporate South Africa. But I will tell you today, corporate South Africa during post-apartheid South Africa's era has no problem adhering to racist legislation, including job reservation for blacks and using the black majority as a source of cheap labor. That's exactly what's going on. I mean, Nehemiah, thank you for the input. But once again, you tell only part of the story. The rest of the story is the reality is that, and I've said this over and over again, as you've alluded to here, cater enrichment schemes are for ANC patronage networks, not for black South Africans. This is what it just beggars imagination, boggles my mind, Ernst. In 1994, there were about 34 million South Africans total. And a huge percentage of that were white and colored. And that number's dropped precipitously as a percentage, but the numbers haven't gone down that much because the black population has doubled. So, in 1994, you had maybe 8 million black South Africans living in poverty. Today, you have over 30 million black South Africans living in abject poverty. But it's Jan van Riebeck's fault, and it's all because of the apartheid era. Well, if it's because of the apartheid era, why aren't we dismantling apartheid era race laws, ANC? Oh, because they work to your advantage, right?
Absolutely, and I don't know if you have the capability to put it on screen, Chris, but to bolster your point, I sent you a graph that was part of Phumlani Majosi's presentation that shows how the top 10% of the different races have been affected by ANC policy. But if you can't put it on screen, I'll just read off some of the details of it.
No, I'll be able to do that. I've just got to get to it a second here. Go ahead and continue with your point, and I'll get on screen, and I'll tell you when it's up.
Yeah. Sure. So one of my central points in my presentation was the vicious cycle between government failure and race-based policy. So what happens? Well, firstly, the ANC fails to address the key crises facing the country: electricity crisis, education crisis, crime crisis, corruption crisis, water crisis. All of these crises and education crisis, they fail to address it. So what does that mean? Well, when your race-based policies, if you justify them by saying we will cease with our race-based policies as soon as, for example, poverty is eliminated, inequality is eliminated, all these goals that they set out. Well, when you fail continuously to reach those goals through being unable to address these crises, well, that means you're going to discriminate indefinitely. If you say we are going to keep discriminating through legislation until these problems are solved, and you fail to solve these problems, that means you're going to racially discriminate forever. That's the vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle is made worse because these race-based policies actually worsen a lot of these crises. For example, the electricity crisis at Eskom. You can't tell me that firing and hiring people based on their race at the state's electricity monopoly has not had an effect on load shedding. When you're not hiring people that are the best based on merit, you're hiring them and firing them based on their skin color. And it has been reported over the years of how engineers have been fired at Eskom simply being white. Another example how the racist legislation of the ANC impacts these crises is safety. So, for example, with Starlink is being blocked in South Africa because the ANC is telling Elon Musk that your company needs to have 30% or has to reach our race-based criteria. I think 30% in their terms previously disadvantaged. It's pretty much just the softened euphemism for race criteria. Because Starlink does not match the ANC's race criteria, it's being blocked in South Africa, while Lesotho and Eswatini are getting Starlink. Eswatini already has Starlink. Lesotho is getting Starlink next year. And to get back to my point, how's that affecting crime? Well, it is affecting rural areas particularly, where Starlink would be an amazing alternative to get high quality internet access in rural areas to be able to dispatch help and call for help if there's a problem, or to communicate if there's any issues related to crime. But now these rural South Africans are being robbed of that opportunity because the ANC wants a cut. The government wants a cut from Starlink to be able to probably put some CADA in there and do some CADA deployments. And Elon Musk is just saying, no, I'm not doing that.
Well, I'll bring it up in just a second, but Nehemiah Frederick says it's to readdress, to bring us into an economy that we've been historically excluded from. You make a false equivalence. Well, number one, there was no such economy. It was created by the people who built South Africa, and that included black South Africans, colors, and Indians. But whites were predominant in the 20th century. That's a fact. But it wasn't built by you. And who is us? Who is us? Over half the population was born after 1994, and it has no reference point to what you're referring to. And why should I? Now, you might go, well, Elon Musk is South African, and so he benefited from the exploitation. I'm not South African. I grew up in abject poverty in rural Appalachia. So why should I be discriminated against and my wealth stolen by racist ANC cadres because I have to give equity for any investment I make in South Africa? Do you not understand the foolishness of the argument you're making, Nehemiah? You are advocating for racism. That's what you're advocating for. That's what it is. Okay, Ernst, I've got the graph up now on the screen. Sure. And let me put it up. This is from The Economist. Well, it's from The Economist in 2019. And it puts to bed the argument that Nehemiah is making. Look at how many more people have been pushed into abject poverty as a consequence of the ANC's GEAR program, growth, education, and reinvestment, and its policy since then. And look at this. So, Ernst, why don't you explain the graph?
Sure. So this graph, what it shows is actually quite shocking. South Africa, the percentage change in income between 1993 and 2019, based on every racial group, at the top 10%, 40, the middle 40%, and the bottom 50%. So let's look at the top 10% first. The black bar is black South Africans. The top 10%, their income, the percentage change in their income has been 200%. For Asian South Africans, it's been it seems like about between 50 and 100, it seems like about 80 or 90%. For colored South Africans, it's also there in the same range, about 85, 90% change. For white South Africans, the top 10%, It's below. I'm guessing here, seeing as the graph is a bit compressed, but it seems like about 20 or 15% there change in income.
When you put that in perspective, now we're talking about the top 10% people who are black, Asian, colored, and white. But their income growth for the top 10%, the people constantly blame the so-called white monopoly capitalists, their growth is less than inflation over that period of time.
Right. So middle 40%. Here again, well, from here, it's just everyone's losing, almost everyone. So middle 40%, only the black South African demographic there has seen any change in their income. Also around, it seemed, I'm guessing here, about 30% growth in income. When it comes to Asian South Africans, there's a decrease, seems like about 5%. For the colored South Africans, it's a bit more. It seems like about 10%. And for white South Africans, it seems stagnant. There's this tiny little graph there. It might be about, or a tiny little bar there. It might be 2 or 3% positive change there. Bottom 50%, let's see what's going on here. They're all getting screwed. Bottom 50%, black South Africans, Asian South Africans, colored South Africans, white South Africans, all dropped in their income. But again, nowhere whites are coming out on top. Everywhere you can see the product of how the ANC policies are affecting the South African population. And the thing that stands out the most for me here is now you put this graph, or you put these statistics into the context of an unemployment rate that just keeps growing: 25%, 27%, 30%, 31%, 32%. I think this year there was a growth. This first quarter, there was another growth spurt in the South African unemployment rate. I think it's now again up to about just over 32%. That's not expanded rate.
In actual numbers, the most recent quarter, 22,000 jobs were added, 322,000 were lost.
Yeah. So I have a very simple question to anyone saying, well, these policies are put in there to level the playing field, to help black South Africans catch up. I have a very simple question: is how's that working out? These policies didn't get put in yesterday. They've existed for over 2 decades now. The first racial legislation started being pushed by the ANC in around 1997, 1998. That's more than 2 decades of racialist legislation supposed to right the wrongs of the past, to redress, to affirmative action. How's that working out? 32% unexpanded unemployment rate, 40 plus percent unemployment rate if you take the unexpanded definition that takes into account people that have stopped looking for work. And then you look at the statistics here about how incomes have changed. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, your only response can pretty much be, don't believe your lying eyes.
Well, all I can say is that anyone who makes the argument that this is to enrich black South Africans is delusional and dishonest or disingenuous. I mean, it's quite obvious. It's been obvious for 20 years that these policies are intended to enrich a coterie of elite black politicians and their favorite patronage network. I mean, it's ridiculous on every measure. I mean, education, Cyril Ramaphosa is very fond of running around saying that Bantu education was worse than no education at all. And I'm on record as saying repeatedly that that's correct. ANC Bantu education outcomes are worse than no education at all. When you send kids to school and they get 32% in chemistry and 35% in maths and 36% in something else, and then they get 42% in their first language, and you hand them a piece of paper and saying, here you go into the world. You're a high school graduate. You qualify to matric to go to university. They're functionally illiterate. And all you're doing is creating chaos, and it's intentional. This is the number of black South Africans who are living off of government grants coming from the small number of taxpayers is astronomical. It's 38, 40 plus million people out of 60 million people living off of welfare. Not because of Jan van Riebeck, not because of land distribution, not because of anything other than the macroeconomic policies of a failed kleptocratic state, which is on the verge of losing its majority for the first time since 1994. And I would argue it's long overdue. I mean, this is ridiculous. There's nothing the ANC has done to make life better for black South Africans. They claim to have ended apartheid. That's a fiction. That's an absolute fiction. All the main, most egregious racist legislation was gone by 1992. You know, the anti-miscegenation, that you couldn't have relations with black and white folks, gone. Pass laws, gone. Land theft, gone. All of that was gone. They didn't bring that. The ANC claims they brought it. They didn't bring any of that. South African society changed before they came to power, and now they want to live off the teat of a false history that they tell. I'll tell you, Ernst, the most telling story is if you ever visited the anti-apartheid or the Apartheid Museum in Gold Reef City in Soweto, and visit it repeatedly over the years, which I did. I've been there I think it's closed now. I was there half a dozen times. And every time I went, it became less about the true story of how apartheid ended and the struggle, and more about the heroic struggle of the ANC, who was responsible for everything when they're actually responsible for very little other than necklacing 20,000 Inkatha supporters in KZN in the 1980s. Anyway, that's a little bit of a rant because I just get so sick of hearing this nonsense from the ANC.
Well, and then also they try to create the sham image of we are this non-racial party, we are a non-racial country, and again, like I don't know what to tell you. If you look at the facts, South Africa is one of the, if not the most racialist regime in the world. Let me just put this on the table. If I didn't tell you what country I was talking about, and I just told you there's a country in the world that has 141 race laws on the books, you'd say that's a racialist regime. That is a messed up, race-obsessed regime. And then I tell you, oh, it's non-racial post-1994 South Africa. That'll shock so many people because they're not aware of this fact. But they are starting to become aware of this fact, because I mean you can only sweep so much under the rug before there's a little mountain starts growing under the rug and all your guests start asking what's going on there, why does it look like you parked a car under the rug in your living room? Like, no, it's just all the scandals, all the racialist rhetoric, all the just hatred and failed policies and destruction that I'm trying to hide. And I mean, that's the reality of the ANC's legacy. And I mean, when people talk about the past and the present, I cannot take your condemnation of the racial discrimination by the previous government seriously if you condone and even celebrate discriminatory legislation by the current government in the present. The AfriForum stance is very clear. We're standing on rock solid ground. Racial discrimination and racially discriminatory policies by the government in the past was wrong, and it's wrong in the present by the current government. It's so easy when you just operate based on principle. Then I don't have to twist myself into a pretzel to try and explain why my worldview is so messed up. But our opponents, or the ANC, have to twist themselves into the shape of a pretzel, and their supporters, or people that say that these racially discriminatory laws are justified, have to twist themselves into the shape because they have to somehow create the perception that they are non-racialists and they are very, very offended and against racial discrimination in the past. But in the present, it's lovely and beautiful and amazing. Now, anyone, again, like I said, anyone with common sense will look at that, and anyone with a working moral compass will look at that and say, you're not fooling anyone. And I mean, that's what I increasingly are starting to hear from regular, normal people, is like, you're not fooling anyone anymore.
Well, all it takes, as Edmund Burke said, Reverend Mishwe said that a short while ago in my interview, is that for good people to sit around and do nothing, not stand up when evil will triumph. And that's the bottom line here. I mean, that's what's been happening for many years in South Africa, in the United States now. We're living in a dystopian world in which people simply lie about history and distort history to achieve an outcome that's racially discriminatory. We have the state of California, which was not even the country, was never a slave state, then it became a state, never a slave state, and they want to give reparations to people who weren't slaves, who are going to be paid by people who never owned slaves, the vast majority of whom's ancestors immigrated to this country long after the institution of slavery was banned and made illegal in this country. And we have this nonsense going on, and this distortion with this 1619 scumbag project by the New York Times, in which they come with this narrative, well, America's original sin is slavery. I'm sorry, please point out the countries on the globe in 1776, when we declared our independence from the United Kingdom, that were banning slavery. Oh, there were no countries. The first country in the world to ban slavery was, of course, Haiti, after they murdered 40,000 Frenchmen, gang raping and slaughtering the population there. So they banned slavery. So they were the first to do it. The first to ban the slave trade was the UK a couple years after that, in the early part of the 19th century. But what's forgotten about America by these liars is that America, the first time it expanded territorially was the Northwest Ordinance when we got the land from the UK, which became the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Those states were banned into perpetuity, no slavery. Never legally had slavery. That's the first time we expanded territorially. It was so important. We also put in place a constitution that could be amended to end slavery as soon as possible. We are the only country in the world to fight a civil war, brother against brother, to end the institution of slavery. We banned the importation of slaves in 1806, decades before the institution was ended. And we actually hung a white shipping captain who illegally tried to run slaves into the country. Yet all of this is completely ignored. And the same thing in South Africa. I always say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but when Nguni speakers want to talk about colonization and the theft of land and all that, I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it. So when you leaving? And they look at me like, what are you talking about? When you leaving? Well, I mean, the Nguni-speaking Bantu peoples came down the Rift Valley, about 1,800 years ago. They crossed the Zambezi, then they crossed the Limpopo, and they chased, for the most part, most of the Khoisan away into the Kalahari and into the Northern Cape as they expanded southwards, taking their land as a new group of people and settling it and colonizing it. Oh, wait, that's not colonization. Oh, indeed it is. The introduction of an alien culture and political system imposed upon an indigenous population is, in fact, colonization by definition, whether it's in Liberia, in the United States, or in South Africa by the Nguni-speaking peoples and Europeans. So you know what? You can all footsec. Europeans, whites, the Indians, all the Nguni. Leave the land for the coloreds and for the Khoisan. The rest of you can piss off, right?
Yeah, Chris. No, but at the same time, it's so important to push back, to show that, to firstly not use the flowery language of the regime, not to call these laws by their beautiful names, but to call them by what they are: racially discriminatory legislation, not black economic empowerment, affirmative action, redress. No, racially discriminatory policies by a government. That's what they are. You can challenge me on whether it's that or not. You're going to lose, because if you look at what they are that by definition. But until we can drop the euphemisms, there can't be a real conversation around these policies. Until those people, those race-obsessed people that still defend these policies, can't call them by their name, racially discriminatory policies, then there can't really be a level-headed conversation, because then one side is trying to hide something. Why can't you call these policies by their name? Why do you have to give them these weasel word names of like black economic empowerment and affirmative action, which they clearly aren't? And I mean, that's the central thing, is that we need to start pushing back. We need to start not just calling them and pointing out how destructive they are. We need to point out how immoral they are and unjustifiable they are. And I'm seeing that happen all around me in South Africa. I'm seeing massive skepticism against these policies growing. I mean, just last year, I was invited to 2 BEE conferences as a critical voice, as an AfriForum representative. Where have you ever heard of that happening if there was not a massive growth in criticism against these policies? I mean, like I said, I was a speaker at 2 pro-BEE conferences where I was invited to be a dissenting voice, to be a critical voice as an AfriForum representative. That's never happened. That doesn't happen, but it's happening. It's starting to happen now, because these policies are crumbling under their own hypocritical weight, under the weight of their own hypocrisy. And you can see it all around you. And I mean, like I said, the average South African on the street knows BE is a sham. It's an exclusive club, and he isn't in it.
Indeed it is, but you're right, it's unheard of. I'm still waiting on my invitation to speak at a BEE conference. That hasn't been forthcoming. But look, in this dystopian world we live in, and I believe you've got an engagement after this, so we're going to have to break shortly. But in this dystopian world we live in, it's all about name-calling, victimhood, and whataboutism. Every time, and that's what Nehemiah is doing, throwing things out like, well, the corporations are all fine with racism under the National Party. You're right, brother. And they're also fine with it under the ANC. They love it because they profit from it. So playing whataboutism, playing victimhood, people don't lack agency. But that's how intellectuals, that's how black supremacists, that's how white liberals, that's how the ANC and the Democrats govern. They govern with their whataboutism and their victimhood. And they act as if people lack agency. Well, I don't think people lack agency. I think some people are really stupid, but I don't think people lack agency. And it has nothing to do with their skin pigmentation or their ethnic origin. They have agency, and they should be able to exercise agency. But governments seek to oppress and deny agency or prevent people from having agency. And that's the bottom line here. So name calling, whataboutism, and victimhood, these are the tried and true tools of leftists. It might as well come out of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And any final thoughts before we wrap it up here, Ernst?
No, that's it, Chris. Keep using your platform to fight the good fight, to call these, not just these racialist policies in the present, but all the other destructive policies under the ANC government, call them by what they are. Call the demon by its name. Don't just use their language. The leftists are masters at twisting language to make evil things sound good and to make ugly things sound beautiful. But when you point it out, when you point out the reality, the entire facade starts crumbling and they start panicking. And that's why you see this racialist rhetoric from the ANC, this panicked rhetoric, because their facade is crumbling. They're losing they've burned their international goodwill over the decades like it was going out of stock, like there was no tomorrow. They burned it like a coal engine. And now there's nothing left, or almost nothing left. And the same is happening domestically. They've burned all their goodwill with just their lies and their corruption and their hypocrisy. And it's catching up with them now. But Chris, thank you very much for having me back on. I'll definitely get you in touch with some other colleagues of mine that can talk about some of the other laws that the ANC are pushing through, like Bella and the NHI. We're also, AfriForum is in the fight against all of those, and we're in the fight against race-based policies in South Africa as well. And for those that don't know, my name on screen is Ernst van Zyl, but you can also find my content and Conscious Caracal on YouTube and on Twitter. My speech at the conference will be uploaded on my YouTube channel tomorrow. So if you go to the Conscious Caracal YouTube channel and you subscribe there, then you'll know tomorrow. You get a notification tomorrow when my speech there or my presentation is uploaded. And there I go into detail again into this vicious cycle between government failure and race-based policies.
Well, Ernst, I will say one thing that's, I don't know if it's a victory, but a bit of clarity. If you roll back the clock over the past 3 years up until last year, every time you turn around, the legacy media would be describing AfriForum as a political party, and people would be complaining about it as a political party. I've heard no mention of AfriForum, which is a civil rights organization, being called a political party this time around. So I don't know if people
I keep warning them, don't look for us on the ballot. You're going to be disappointed. We're not there.
Exactly. You're going to have to look elsewhere. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the Conscious Caracal from AfriForum, Ernst van Zyl. Bye-bye, donkey. It was a pleasure having you once again, and we'll chat again soon.
Tot ziens.
Okay. All right, folks. Conscious Caracal, Ernst van Zyl there. Thanks for tuning in. I'm debating about whether to do the news at the top of the hour. Do you want news? Let me do a quick informal poll. I have researched the news. We have news to talk about, but it is a long day. I mean, I'm fine. I can do it, but I don't know if there's interest here. If people still want a news program, let me know. And do it in the comments very quickly here before we wrap up. And then I will do the news at the top of the hour. Probably not as long as we usually do it, but I'll do the news. So as observers since 1995 would argue that BEE points system has enabled hundreds, thousands of young black people. Well, yes, it has, John Jarvis. It has enabled thousands of young black people. So what? What of the other 42.5 million? A national sovereign wealth fund that dispersed resources to people turning South African society into an ownership society would have been the correct approach instead of enriching Cyril Ramaphosa, Tokyo Sexwale, Patrice Motsepe, and a host of other cadres. People like Brett Kebbell became fabulously wealthy because of this regime. So what? Thousands of black people like Nehemiah have gotten great opportunities. So what? At the expense of hundreds of thousands of other South Africans, millions of black South Africans. So come on, man. Come on, John. Come on. I've seen it up close and personal too. I'm not impressed by cadres. They mostly feel entitled, like they're owed something. They're arrogant, disrespectful, and quite frankly, all too often condescending and racist. That's been my experience with black cadres. Yep, with the enriched nouveau riche that they have been given everything. So, yep, and Charles asked a very good question. How can you denounce apartheid but then cheer on BE? You can't unless you're a hypocrite. Yep. So who else we got here? They believe they can disrespect us like delusional creatures, one-dimensional. Who's that? Gillum says, thank you. You're very welcome. Okay. And what else we got here? What did I miss? The people who have made it from BE have done so on the back of millions of others. Exactly right. All right. It looks like people want the news. And Myra's saying, please rest. No, Myra, I never rest. You know, that comes at the end of life before you go on to the next stage. So no reason for that. Okay. So we'll do the news here in about 13 minutes. I'll set it up. Oh, good. Thank you, Hendo. The Slovakian president is in stable condition. That's really good news for him. The assassination attempt in Slovakia today. We'll cover the news coming up shortly. Thank you all very much. Top of the hour. Be looking for that. Appreciate it. Thank you all for your comments. Thanks to my guest, Ernst van Zyl. Always a pleasure. And we'll be right back here shortly in about 13 minutes. Just enough time to run to the loo, refresh your drink, top off, take some Xanax, whatever it is. And we'll see you shortly. Cheers, everybody.